Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Roundtable on Piketty and Historical Perspective. Congratulations on being a part of the few who are still here at the last session. You've toughed it out. Just to give you an idea of how we're going to proceed, we'll have each presenter will speak for 10 minutes. And then we'll open it up to sort of rounds of questions. We're going to ask for maybe 4 or 5 questions at a time. Let the members of the roundtable respond, and then we'll open up to another round of questions at the end. So there should be lots of time for questions. And please do think about questions to ask as you're listening to the papers. I should explain, I'm Jeff Reed from Huron University College. I am not an economic historian, and I will simply be facilitating for that reason rather than commenting. Our first presenter today is Julia Abramson. Julia did her PhD in Romance Languages and Literatures at Princeton University in 1999, before taking a position at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, where she is currently an associate professor of French and head of the French program. She has published widely, including 2 books, Learning from Lying, Paradoxes of the Literary Mystification, with University of Delaware Press in 2005, and Food Culture in France with Greenwood Press in 2007. Her current book project is entitled The Culture of Finance, which I suspect is why she was keen to participate in the panel. And I note that she is in the midst of a fellowship, the Gustave Gimond Visiting Scholar Research Fellowship in French Political Economy at Stanford University Libraries. Julia's paper for us today is entitled Culture, Cultural Capital, and Thomas Piketty's Le Capital au XXIe siècle.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for that introduction. Thank you so much, Rachel, for organizing the panel today. Thanks for being here, and thanks very much also to Reagan for organizing this wonderful conference. As I continue to think about what I wanted to say today, I realized that a better, slightly more accurate title for my comment would probably be something like French Culture, Political Economy, and the American Reception of Piketty's Le Capital au XXIe siècle, Capital in the 21st Century, first published in France in 2013 and published in English translation in 2014. I'd like to start out very briefly by with a short quotation from the end of the book, the last page. Tous les citoyens devraient s'intéresser sérieusement à l'argent. All citizens should seriously interest themselves in money. And I note it's a nice coincidence. We are right across the street here in Colorado Springs from the Money Museum, the American Numismatic Association, which I recommend to your attention. So my remarks today address this question of citizens being interested in money. And in my contribution, I want to do this by reflecting on issues of culture and history and what might be learned by approaching Piketty's book, not only as a work of economics, economic history, and political economy, but also as an artifact of French culture. This book, as we know, I will just very briefly capitulate, uses 200 years and more of data to investigate the long-term dynamics of growth, capital, and wealth in 7 rich nations, to reveal a long history of increasing inequality as defined by unequal distribution of wealth, which is particularly marked in the United States today. So despite an overall increase in global wealth, economic inequality is on the rise. And just to summarize again briefly the point of view of the book, the implications of the book, the implication is that we should be concerned, according to Piketty, about the structures that are not working to promote the general interest, democracy, and social justice, but rather new forms of what Piketty calls patrimonial capitalism, such that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. The economy is, in the reading of Piketty, however, mutable, such as through tax policy and other collective political and social decisions, but also through the plethora of individual actions and reactions with their full spectrum of human motivations from self-interest to altruism. So we can, as Piketty tells us, change structures the better to achieve fairer ends, although it will undoubtedly be difficult to coordinate and realize such efforts. So one thing to take away from Piketty, of course, is that is the conviction that any market structure is an artifact of culture, a social construct, and the problem with the current market structure, as he is at pains to demonstrate over 1,000 pages of print in the original French edition and additional databases to which he keeps adding online. The problem with the current market structure is that it's set up to mécaniquement, accumulate capital in the hands of the few and to the disadvantage of the many. So what Piketty does is he performs what we could characterize in Foucauldian terms as a kind of genealogy and archaeology of current economic trends, but also of received economic ideas, liberal, neoliberal ideas that have entered into the tacit dimension of things, particularly in the United States. Now, I've been fascinated to see and to participate, as this panel participates, in the phenomenon of the extraordinary reception of this book, that is to say, the response to this book. And I won't go into this in detail in the interest of time, but I just will mention some relatively recent statistics. According to a recent count, upwards of 1.5 million people worldwide have purchased copies of this book and are reading it or not, it's hard to know, in 39 different languages. And these are statistics current and counting. The book became famous in the United States in its English translation before becoming famous in France, where it was received with somewhat less fanfare, but is now a topic of interest. So there exists, and this is where my remarks come from, what I call an entire discursive field constituted by and about this book and its author, and the topics of economics, politics, and society that he treats. Yet, as many historians have noted, at times in grumbling tones, there is little in Piketty's conclusions that is, strictly speaking, entirely new. The extent and the kind of the data are new, but the conclusions to which Piketty comes express ideas that we're familiar with. And again, I won't go into the details here, but I will just mention a couple of names of scholars from economics, from history, who have treated some of the ideas that Piketty puts forth, such as Gavin Wright, who wrote an essay published in 2001 called Economic History as a Cure for Economics, who criticizes the discipline of economics for its over-reliance on or obsession with math to the detriment of deep thinking about the applications and possible utility of economics to do good in society, Jonathan Searle on the construction of social reality, Karl Polanyi on the dangers of capitalism, Arnold Meyer on the persistence of the old regime beyond 1789. Donald McCluskey has drawn attention to the importance of rhetoric in the economic field. One could also mention the work of Pierre Rozan-Vallon, who writes about the society of equals and other related topics. So in this context, the success of Piketty's book, combined with the already known nature of his conclusions, begs an essential question that I've not seen a good response to, and which I would like to try to begin to address today. And that question is, why Piketty? Why is he the Messiah for these questions? Why is Capital in the 21st Century, among all the available books, having such an impact? Why are so many of us reading it and talking about it? And I think engaging issues of contemporary culture and cultural history, as well as history per se, can help elucidate this, what I call the Piketty phenomenon, the very discursive field that continues to constitute itself to address this work and its implications. And so the main point that I'd like to make, and I'll elaborate a little bit in my statement here, is to note that the book, I think, may be characterized by its democratizing and demystifying aspects, which go hand in hand ideologically and culturally as well as intellectually. Democratizing and demystifying, I use these words very deliberately with their echoes of 18th century French currents and 18th century French and contemporary French cultural values as well. Now, the use of these words is mine, and what I'm claiming is perhaps a bit different than what Piketty himself says explicitly, And I think this is important here. The understated and explicit claim of this enormous book is that it seeks to assist readers to see the dynamics at work in the economy, and thus to outline for them the choices that they will face in the future. And indeed, first and foremost, Capital in the 21st Century teaches and informs. However, I want to suggest that this very modest, explicit claim that Piketty makes and the exceedingly rational and lucid arguments and commentary belie a much bigger and more urgent implicit agenda and the what I would call moral outrage that seems to fuel this quite large and slightly unusual project. And I would suggest that to make one's way as a reader or as a citizen, which is a word that Piketty uses frequently, although he talks about the economy, he does not use the word consumer or individual too often. He uses the word citoyen, citizen. So to make one's way through his book as a citizen, as a member of the populace, who is not a professional economist in particular, is to not merely to learn about economics and economic history and our current situation, but indeed to be initiated into the mysteries and complexities of economics. So in this, I want to suggest that Capital in the 21st Century can usefully be compared to works published in the 18th century, notably the great encyclopedia published at mid-century. And what Piketty does, of course, is he uses the contemporary tools of economics, the big data, characteristic of the current era, and regarded by so many empiricists as the highest form of evidence, perhaps the only acceptable form of evidence, and he looks through a very long historical window to open a conversation that is ultimately about values and about what should be the constituent elements of a good society. And this question he, of course, approaches by bringing together the topics that have so often been separated, particularly in contemporary America, of economics and politics, and in particular between today's forms of capitalism and democracy. So Piketty, in effect, unveils mysteries of his disciplines. He uses formulas, he uses graphs, he speaks to us in very clear and lucid terms, but using the tools of the economist, and extends actual knowledge, shares actual tools with all of us who constitute the non-economist masses, but who nonetheless live in the common economy. We all live financialized lives with more or less awareness about the deep and often remote structures that control us and offer us our choices variously, but with a sure sense of their local and sometimes deleterious negative effects on our lives. So Piketty, and I really kind of want to insist on this because I believe it can help to begin to answer the question of why Piketty, why is this book in particular having such a tremendous effect and receiving such a wide response. Piketty has, in some sense, crashed the walls of his own disciplinary temple and has invited us in first to learn and then to go forth, armed with new knowledge, the better, presumably, to make our way thereafter. He himself is an adept in the economic temple, but bursts out of the inner sanctum, rejects the halo of the sacred, and mixes with the laity. That's me and others who are not professional economists. And he stated in an interview with the historian who's part of this group, Kenneth Mouret, the interview that was published in the H. France Salon very recently, Piketty has stated, "I want to reach normal people." I will perhaps flatter myself for the moment that I might be one of these normal people that Piketty invokes here. So to do this, Piketty, in some sense, demystifies the market and its workings for any reader open to financial and economic enlightenment. And he thus empowers the reader through knowledge to critique the market and its ends and potentially to act to change it. So the book seeks to realize what I characterize as a project of social and political and economic enlightenment. And in doing this, Piketty seems to make a lot of assumptions about the citoyen, who also is the proverbial general reader, the member of the reading public. This person is apparently capable of coming to individual judgment about political economy once he or she is given information. This person is apparently capable of reflection. And indeed, I think this, again, explains part of the strong response to the book. In the contemporary era, we've been trained in some sense. We are more or less literate, and we were trained for information access. But I think Piketty's attitude, the vocabulary, the stance that he assumes, which is intellectual and historical, but also ideological, this sort of cultivated egalitarian stance of the author should not be underestimated. And as a concluding remark, I'll just throw out something which may be worth paying attention to, even the, not just the rhetoric, the availability of the data in his book, the fact that Piketty himself has been apparently available for different kinds of interviews, many of which can be seen on YouTube, on the internet. He's responded to many of his critics. And if you take a little while to watch some of these interviews, and you are interested in things like the semiotics of dress, the way in which the stance of the body, the clothes that one chooses, signal certain ideas and ideals, certain ideologies. It is interesting to note that when Piketty appears for interviews, he generally does so in an open-collared shirt with a sport jacket or a sweater. He does not wear ties and suits, and so appears in notable contrast, particularly with senior American economists, who get suited up, and even when they share his political views, appear by contrast as the proverbial fat cats, the suits, by contrast with Piketty, who takes this stance as one of the people. So thank you very much. I'll stop there, and perhaps there'll be time to discuss these ideas more in conjunction with those of the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Our second reflection today comes from Rachel Krastel. Rachel completed her PhD in history at Yale University in 2005 and has been a Fulbright scholar working in Strasbourg in 2009, and is also a past holder of the research fellowship to work in the Gustave Gimond collection on French political economy at the Stanford University Libraries. And if you're sensing a theme there, you'll see that comes up several times. She is currently Associate Professor of History at Xavier University in Cincinnati, where she has notably won the university's Teaching Award and has also published a great deal. Her publications include two monographs, Organizing for War, France from 1870 to 1914, with Louisiana State University Press in 2010, and The Siege of Strasbourg with Harvard University Press in 2014. Her comments today for us are entitled From Malthus to Piketty, Demography and Inequality in Political Economy.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for that nice introduction. So I've come at this via my new project, which is completely different from the things that Jeff just mentioned. It's on childlessness. But today I'm focusing on low fertility in general, which is really not always correlated with low childlessness. These are really two distinct phenomena. One of my questions in this project regards the common concern about the upward trend of the dependency ratio, that is the ratio of children and the elderly to the adult population. Just last weekend, you see it all the time, but just last weekend the New York Times published yet another article regarding this problem, this time framed around sex education courses in Denmark that encourage pregnancy. So what is the historically minded response to the dependency ratio? How might we think about it? I'd like to highlight three major points then in comparison between Piketty and Thomas Robert Malthus, structured around three questions that I hope will spark additional conversation. The first question is, what is the relationship between economic growth and demographic growth? Malthus famously argued in his 1798 essay on population that economic development stimulates demographic growth. Left to our own devices, our exponential reproduction will outstrip the increase in agricultural production. Eventually, population growth leads to economic strain, starvation, war, disease, and the population collapses. I'm sure we're all familiar with this. The dynamics of population included mechanisms for growth and for decline, but Malthus believed that there was a natural process that kept populations in check. Now, Malthus was wrong, at least globally, and at least for now, right, in the short term of the last 200 years or so, and at least within the order of magnitude that we exist right now. We'll see what happens when we reach 70 billion. But the dominant demographic theory today takes the opposite view of Malthus. To simplify, economic development, along with basic female education, has led to lower fertility. But for Piketty, economic growth and demographic growth are two distinct things. I mean, this is, I think, pretty common. They're two distinct kinds of growth. And while he believes that low demographic growth is likely to characterize the 21st century, he eschews predicting what this demographic change will look like. He doesn't want to get very precise about this. Quote, "What demographic history teaches us is that these childbearing decisions are largely unpredictable. They are influenced by cultural, economic, psychological, and personal factors related to the life goals that individuals choose for themselves." End quote. When it comes to fertility, again I quote, "anything is possible." Rather than an exponential model, Piketty's discussion sounds analogous to nonlinear dynamic change, also known as chaos theory, except that chaos theory is deterministic. If you know all the little to a very precise degree, like you can see how it all spins out. So I think there's an interesting, different kind of discourse here. This perspective on demography also, it parallels and I think informs his understanding of capital in general. First, that capital is not subject to a natural pattern or a natural stasis, a natural stability, right? We can modify it and it can get out of control, in fact. And second, that economic development and industrialization are not, in and of themselves, interesting to him. They simply change the landscape in which capital is accumulated and distributed, but he doesn't care so much about whether it's landed capital or industrial capital. So I think this informs his understandings. My second question is, what is the relationship between demographic growth and human misery? For Malthus, demographic growth undermined capital accumulation and caused poverty. Piketty argues the opposite. Demographic growth tends to support greater equality, and therefore it creates a more just society. Growth undermines the importance of inherited wealth and encourages the creations of new skills and social functions. Demographic growth therefore allows each generation to recreate itself. And low growth, whether we're talking about economic or demographic, low growth hastens the accumulation of capital among the wealthy and therefore tends to lead to greater inequality. In a society in which the wealth that already exists has this disproportionate importance, then even a small amount of savings means that those who already control wealth will become better and better off. And when the rate of return on investment is greater than the economic growth of the economy, wouldn't you rather have wealth you can already invest instead of generate new wealth in some other way? So Piketty argues that we have seen this borne out. In France, as in other wealthy countries, the last few decades have seen an increase in the share of both capital and income for the wealthiest decile and centile, and an increase in the importance of inheritance. And this goes to the data that he's collected, of course. In all of these measures, Europe and the United States are approaching the inequality of pre-1914. Piketty ascribes this increase in inequality to a number of factors: privatization, long-term catch-up of real estate and stock prices, a political climate that is friendly to private wealth. But essential to his argument is decreased growth since the 1980s, especially low demographic growth. And capital accumulation poses a real threat to social stability then. Although we've avoided the apocalyptic vision of Marx due to the growth of productivity and the diffusion of knowledge, capital still holds this dramatic sway over labor. So my third question is, what is the way out of this mess? For Malthus believed that the virtuous delay of marriage provided the only peaceful way out. Indeed, his praise of old maids, whose conduct, he says, quote, contributed more to the happiness of society than that of the matron, end quote. And he goes on and on. It's beautiful. It's so delightful to read this in comparison to the dreary natalism that we've all encountered here and there in French history. But Malthus although he actually cut this out when he himself got married. So the later versions. But Malthus's conclusions are draconian. Those who did not possess material resources, workers especially, would just have to rein in their passions for the good of society in order to avoid the more devastating positive checks of war or famine. The population balance would be achieved, but we could choose how painful that balance would be. So you might be thinking that Piketty's way out would be then to promote a higher birth rate, but of course it's not. It's to promote distribution. He's pessimistic that growth is the way toward greater equality in the 21st century, even though he argues that is what would create more equality. But low growth is far more common in human history than high growth. High growth has never been as high as we commonly think it is. Even in the period 1950 to 1990, it was on average an annual total global growth rate of 4%. which we sometimes think is like low, but it's not. And that's economic and demographic growth put together, that 4%. But if we take the longer perspective, then even that 4% is very hard and less sustainable. World population growth surely must slow down, unless I'm wrong, as Malthus was. I mean, we'll see. And again, and I think this goes back to why Piketty doesn't want to say very much about why demographic change happens. We can't predict this. So therefore, instead, we have to pass a global tax on wealth to redistribute it, right? So and so I think, according to Piketty, the dependency ratio is a red herring. France, Japan, Germany, Denmark, they all have enough wealth privately somewhere, right, to prevent their elderly population from living in destitution. That's really not, that doesn't have to be a problem. So he would argue it's not a Malthusian problem of supply and demand, it's a distribution problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.